So several people today have mentioned things about teaching the limits of AI, teaching them certain skills to make them more human. And so our next guest is Casey Sackett from Wobot, who is going to talk about how to teach empathy to a machine.
All right. Yes, I think that was a really great segue. I think a number of the themes I'm going to be talking about today have already been touched upon, everything from product management to feature selection to empathy. So really happy to be talking about empathy today. We'll organize this in the following way. I mean, I'll do a little bit of background, a little context setting about why empathy matters and why I think we should all care about it in this room, even though we might have all very different interests or problem domains. Then I'll talk a little bit about the definition of empathy, because I think it's a little abstract. And then I'll talk about some very specific machine learning and NLP approaches to empathy. These are more like ideas, kind of exploratory things. And then I'll conclude with some examples. So background, why I think empathy matters. So, I mean, the first thing is I have to put one of these kinds of slides up about, with a big dollar figure on here, but we all know that health is costing a lot in the US and worldwide. And if you look at it, if you break it down, you'll see that mental disorders are actually a large part of that. Over 200 billion total cost to the US. This is a lot of a trickle-down kind of effect. There's a lot of different side things from hospitalization to comorbidity. But even worse, 58% of people with various mental disorders do not receive any care for various reasons. Either because they're the stigma associated with it, or because just lack of qualified therapists, worldwide. So I'm from Wobot Labs. Our mission is to make the best psychological tools radically accessible to everyone. We do that right now with an app called Wobot. It's a chatbot that you can download on iOS and Android, and you can chat with Wobot about anything you might feel, any problems you might be having, and Wobot helps you feel better. So it started with a randomized control trial coming out of Stanford a couple years ago, where we showed that a chatbot can significantly reduce depression symptoms after 2 weeks. So what's interesting about this is if you look, and why this is related to empathy, is that if you try to break down therapy, there's been a number of studies around this, and kind of what happens in therapy, the actual techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy or psychodynamics, pick your favorite kind of school of thought, are a smaller factor. Actually, one of the biggest factors is therapeutic alliance. And behind therapeutic alliance, of course, are things like client-therapist rapport and empathy. So another reason why I think this is important is that I think, over the last 5 years, machine learning and AI has made significant progress, and we've hit a lot of things like handwritten digit recognition and things like that. And then there's a lot of talk about how, AI will eat the rest of the world, right? And that means that you have to go into higher and higher order kinds of concepts. And here's an example, from my domain, but it's anxiety and depression. And the fact of the matter is that we talk about this and we have clinical, reimbursement codes for this and everything, but they're actually very similar. About 80% of the symptoms overlap. And I think in many of our areas, this is probably true. And as good research scientists, this should probably bother you. It bothers me. I like to be exact. So if we dive in and we said, okay, well, what is empathy? There are a number of psychologists out there that have kind of complex definitions of it. I won't read all this, but Carl Rogers has one. It seems to be something about understanding the other and back and forth. And you say, well, if you tried to approach this the old way, you might create features, or if you looked at traditional NLP, you might model it. But the new way was to use deep learning. So let's just replace the therapist with a robot, and then throw a big neural network at it, right? Problem solved. But I think that this doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because we're basically talking about that output layer. We don't actually know what that output layer should look like. We don't know what our objective function should be. We don't know what kind of cost optimization to do. So it's kind of a circular problem. So I do think we need to figure out what empathy is before you can actually approach it. You can try etymology. I don't think that tells you too much, and I'm not going to try to pronounce these words, but you can see it means something about feeling into. And then you can also look at what happens. By the way, when I talk about empathy, I mean like interpersonal kind of empathy, not like empathy for your user, but in human-human interactions in the moment, what kinds of things constitute empathy in those moments. So this was a really interesting paper. It was a large-scale analysis of counseling conversations. You can look at those and kind of feel and understand, using NLP techniques, what are some of the things that constitute successful counselors versus non. Two of them stood out for me are ambiguity. The best counselors reduce ambiguity right away by asking the right kind of probing questions. And another one is adaptability. The best counselors match their user expressions, of their clients. And if we look at another paper that talks about what is empathy, similar. I think that there are two main aspects that I'll focus on. One is knowing the other person, kind of knowing what they're feeling and identifying their emotions, and then sharing in those emotions, so affect sharing. So if we were to take those two, obviously it's probably more complex than that, but if we just take those two aspects and kind of say what kinds of things could we do in ML to approach those, we might start first with the know the user part. You would say, well, isn't this kind of already solved? There's this thing called sentiment analysis. Just run that on there, and you'll be fine, right? It's been done for a long time. You can count number of words of certain types. There are these dictionaries that are based on polarity and valence about what certain words are more positive and negative, and you can see a nice chart of it here. But I think the issue here is that sentiment, is traditionally trained on movie kind of databases and ratings of movies, and then that's not really the same as the domain that you're probably dealing with, and certainly not the same as the one that I'm dealing with every day. So I think we need to go deeper. I think it really talks to the fact that feature engineering is crucial, not only for model optimization, but just before that even, trying to understand your domain. I loved Vic's slide about feature selection in real estate. This is very similar. So I think here's an example of work done by Jurafsky and others, where they were looking at, they had this awesome data set of police camera footage from Oakland. And they were looking at just casual stops, roadside stops, and whether or not there is racial kind of discrimination or any differences in the kinds of language that police officers use. So if you were to do just sentiment analysis, that would be in the kind of middle here, like the positive words, you'll see that that's there's not a strong effect. So if you did traditional sentiment analysis, you're done, nothing really here, let's move on to something, there's no paper here. But what you really had to do, and what his team did, was get very creative, understand the particular domain here, and build features around those. So things like hands on the wheel, that's obviously only something for this particular domain, or whether or not you're using formal titles like Mr. Or being more casual. So I think this really illustrates the importance of feature engineering. Also under Know the User, there's a ton of recent approaches. I think that the challenge here is staying up to date on the literature, but also getting really creative about it. So some of the things that we're using quite a bit of is BERT. I think many of you probably have heard about this and how it's just brought transfer learning and the power of NLP to a new level in the last year. So using semantic similarity instead of just word counts allows us to find things that are in a similar semantic space, but somewhat related. So here's a principal component analysis or a T-SNE graph. This is actually MNIST in the graph. If some of you may have seen that before. But you can do similar things in your own domains. But first you do have to recognize what are those concepts and then find them and do these kinds of clusterings. So moving on to the second part of the empathy would be how do you share somebody's affect or give them a sense of similarity. So I think here again you can stay up to date with the literature, and Vision often has a lot of things that you can borrow. So in Vision, you may have seen some of this where you have neural style transfer, a really cool technique where you can take a painting by a famous artist, maybe it's Van Gogh, or you pick your favorite, take some other painting and you can transfer it and make that other painting in that original style. It's very cool. You can actually do some of this in language. There are a few different approaches. So one interesting one is actually using the Bible. So the Bible is an example of a parallel corpus. We have many translations of the same semantic content in different styles. And the cool thing about that is you can pull out certain characteristics from that. Like you could have a measure of formality, like it might be more similar to King James Version, and less. So this has been an interesting way to kind of basically do neural translation, but do it in a way that translates style. So that's interesting. Another one is more in our space in Wobot is a persona chat kind of dialogue. So if you do not have an entire corpus, which most of us don't, you can still transfer the style. And in this particular paper, they took a chatbot and they're interested in saying, can we imbue that chatbot with a personality? So they would take like 5 statements and describe the personality of that chatbot, and then do natural language generation and see if it could embody the personality of it. So again, some ideas. Let's see. All right. So if you try to put all this together, I think there's a lot of proof in the details, obviously, but you can do some things of knowing the user by clustering and understand where they are. You can do some things with BERT and other latest techniques to transfer style, and then put it all together into your particular domain, and of course, out comes a conversation that should understand where the person is and have the person and kind of get closer to what the person's feeling. So I'm going to give an example of somebody much larger than Wobot, which is Microsoft and Xiao Ice. So this, is a really great chatbot that's popular in China. Very complex. They have many different domains. You can do things like uploading a photo, and it will analyze the photo and then talk to you about what's in the photo. But what I found was really interesting, they have a great paper that I encourage everybody to read, is at the core of it is this empathic computing engine. And much of the paper talks about how everything comes back to this computing engine. So I find that fascinating. This is not obviously a mental health company, but I think it shows the importance that it's going to become in just about all of our domains. So some quick conclusions. I think in order to go after these other domains that are involve higher order kind of messy concepts, I think we have to all be really brave and creatively apply machine learning to these constructs. I think feature engineering is crucial. I think it has to be very domain specific. I think you have to become one with your data, as Andre Karpathy recently kind of published. I think you have to do lots of exploratory data analysis to find these kind of creative insights. And I think you have to apply the latest research in unique ways to your domain. I think we have to get creative with our objectives and our cost functions. They're going to become more complex. And I think we have to take inspiration from multiple lines of research. I think the things I brought up and touched upon involved everything from reinforcement learning to adversarial networks and so on. And we just have to get and dive into all of those. So that's all I've got. Left a little extra time for questions.
Great.
Your conversational AI therapist is in market currently?
I wouldn't call us a therapist per se. Like it's actually probably more like interactive self-help. So it's an evolution beyond books.
How long has it been in market?
We've been live for 2 years.
How many sessions have you done? Ballpark?
Like conversational sessions?
Yeah.
Just over 100 million, but
Wow.
Yeah.
And what are the top 3 examples of extraordinary outcomes that have happened during those 100 million conversations that you've heard about from your users or learned about subsequently?
I mean, I don't know if I would call them extraordinary outcomes, but I think what motivates
Positive outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I think what motivates me like day to day is just seeing user reviews or kind of customer service tickets that they're just more personal. It's like, oh, that Woebot works for them day to day and has made a difference on their lives. For me, it's if you can change individuals, then I think that's extraordinary. But
What is the goal of the Woebot?
the Woebot, the goal is to help people feel better, help them achieve their goals, help them become more aligned with what they want.
What if their goals are sociopathic or otherwise non-positive in a human way? And do you have any insight into that? In other words, if Elizabeth Holmes or Jeffrey Dahmer were on the product, and I'm not saying those things are tightly correlated, but if the reason I'm asking this is I'm using the most extreme example because what defines world positive in this case, and I guess that big fear that Rob and I talked about in the beginning was when we build these technologies, the street finds their own use for them, and how do you think about bad people using it and to encourage them to do bad things, and do you have some safeguard against that?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, we're agnostic to goals. But with that said, there are obviously we have to build in kind of crisis detection. I mean, UX is very important, so we're very clear from the beginning that we're not a person, we're not a crisis service, and those sorts of things. But with that said, we do have to detect when they happen. So if a goal involves them saying, explicitly stating that they want to harm another person, then we would escalate.
Has that happened?
It very rarely happens. We have not had the particular individuals that you mentioned use our app
yet. Good. But you have had people, I'm sure, talk about suicide or harming other people. I want to kill this person. What exactly do you do in that situation?
So we have the crisis detection system, and it's when that happens, and we err on the side of triggering it a little more often than we should, because it's more the false positive thing. When that happens, we say, hey, this looks like it's a little bit beyond my capabilities, and we give people resources to contact.
Got it. So the same approach that Google and Wikipedia took to suicide techniques. When people would type those in, they give them a suicide prevention hotline number, and then they give them the techniques. You don't give them the techniques.
We don't actually give them the techniques. No. We
No,
feel
it's
like
a big
that's
debate on
beyond
Wikipedia if you could have an adult discussion about how people kill themselves for scientific research or whatever. And they still have the suicide techniques page, but they put at the top, the sort of uplifting, call this number and you can get help kind of situation.
Yeah, we are on the side of you probably should talk to a human at this point.
How do you make money?
That's something
or ultimately, how do you feel you're going to make money?
Something we're still working out that I probably don't want to touch on too much here. I ultimately think we'll probably make money through clinical enterprises, through hospitals and helping reduce that 201 billion that you saw up there. But how that's done, there's a lot of different details.
Seems like this could be a great gateway to getting a prescription.
Perhaps.
Okay.
You're going to go home and try this, aren't you? I know you.
I was doing it during the break. I was gonna end with that. But you could literally talk to it and say, I'm feeling depressed, and maybe get some anti-depression drugs or something. Okay, let's take 2 questions real quick. And don't criticize the moderator, host, for asking a bunch of questions. I'm a professional at this, sir. This is what I do for a living, is ask interesting questions. Go ahead. Let's see if your question is more interesting than mine. Here we go. Go ahead.
So Jessica said that empathy wasn't a good thing for their bot, and you are saying that it's a good thing for your bot. So how do you interpret this conflict?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think I was here for Jessica's, and I think we are talking. There are different types of empathy, and I think that empathy was, the empathy that a product designer has for their user, and I think the empathy I'm talking about here is that moment-to-moment empathy between 2 people. And And so it is a little weird, like, because Woebot is having that conversation with users. And also, kind of to be clear, like the similarity stuff that I'm talking about is a little more on the research and development side. I think what's ultimately important and what we practice the most at Woebot is just good conversational design and a certain style in Woebot. So we have like a clinical team of content writers who is responsible for Woebot's voice and for writing this content, and it's definitely an art that it would be very hard to approximate with NLP techniques as they stand right now. So it's really about, yeah, you don't want to be too cloying, or and especially in a clinical setting, you have to go even beyond what's effective as far as like making a user engage, but also what's clinically effective, like not to reward positivity all the time, because negative feelings aren't necessarily something to be avoided. So there's a lot of nuance in those details.
Great. Another question?
From your presentation, like you mentioned neural style transfer to define like empathy, like for your conversation like AI. But can you, like, I got an impression that like you are collecting like user data like, to build like empathy, customized like for the specific user. Can you explain the implementation like more in detail?
Sure. So this would be another area where it's more exploratory.
Yes.
So I think the idea there is, you can have different types of personalities of users. So one good example might be that there are users of Woebot who have been in therapy before and who might be very familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, and they can speak that language, cognitive dissonance and all these kinds of things. And then there are other users who may not know anything about it and are much more casual in their language. So if you took those two and you wanted to adapt the kinds of lessons and coursework that we have in Woebot to those two users, what you might do is have a formality neural transfer style thing, or a neural transfer kind of engine that can do formal versus informal, and then it could take the content that our content creators have created, and basically do like a retrieve and refine kind of system, where you take that content, change it slightly to give it either more formality, more technical speak, or less. So that would be an example of how you do it. And then, of course, you might have other types of user profiles, and you'd want to adapt your system in that way too. So it's not like totally open-ended. I don't think we should be applying natural language generation to mental health kind of uncontrolled, because you could, for obvious reasons, I think you could say the wrong things.
Thank you.
Thank you, Casey.